If you're like a lot of people who live far away from Egypt, you may picture this land as a sea of undulating sand dunes, punctuated by pyramids that sit essentially in the middle of nowhere. But this really isn't representative of what Egypt looks like either today or in ancient times. And the country actually varies a lot from one place to another in terms of the geography. So what was it like where ancient Egyptians actually lived? Well, stay tuned because that's what we'll be talking about in this video today. Welcome to the Dead Speak Online, where we demystify the words and lives of the ancient Egyptians through animated videos like this one. If you're new here, consider subscribing. When we look at a map of modern Egypt, it's true that most of it is dry desert. And while the borders in ancient times were actually quite similar to the modern ones, most people actually lived near the Nile or near an oasis, not out in the middle of the desert. And this remains mostly true today in modern Egypt as well. Today in this video, I'll be talking about the places where most ancient Egyptians lived. That is the Nile Valley and the Nile Delta. And in other videos, I'll talk about other parts of the country. So check the description below for links to those videos. So what was it like to live by the Nile during pharaonic times? Well, in a word, wet. Not only did the Nile provide the water for most people's daily needs in ancient Egypt, but it also provided the water and fertilizer needed for growing food in ancient Egypt, and it did this by flooding its banks every year during the summer. This annual flood was brought on by heavy rains around the origin of the Nile, especially in what is now Ethiopia. The floodwaters, when they finally receded, left behind a rich, black topsoil, as well as basins of trapped water, both of which were wonderful for growing a variety of crops, but especially grains like wheat and barley. This black mud that was left behind by the flood also was used for everyday items, such as making pottery and also making bricks for building houses. Of course, people need water to survive, so living near the Nile or another source of water is a necessity. But it wasn't all about having water to drink. Since the vast majority of people in ancient Egypt worked on farms, they also lived very close to the farmland that was continually soaked either by the annual flood or by artificial irrigation. Farming in the Nile were so central to the ancient Egyptians' way of life that their calendar revolved around them. The year was divided into 3 seasons: the flood season, the growing season, and the harvest or drought season. Now, because farming was so central to the ancient Egyptian way of life, they had to maintain a careful balance between living close to these resources, close to their farms, but not so close to the Nile that they ran a risk of having their houses washed away during the annual flood. They also didn't want to take up valuable farmland with their houses, so they usually lived right along the edge of the farms. Thus, contrary to the sort of popular idea of a culture in the middle of the desert, the ancient Egyptians actually lived really close to the water, and oftentimes in rather damp conditions along the edges of their farms. The environment of Egypt also provided some great natural boundaries from its neighbors. So to the north, for example, around the mouth of the Nile Delta, or rather mouths, where it spills into the Mediterranean, it's rather difficult to navigate by boat. To the northeast, we have the Sinai Peninsula, which is covered with desert, making it difficult to travel between Egypt and Egypt's northeastern neighbors in what we now call the Near East. To the south, the Nile is broken up by a series of what we call cataracts, which are basically big outcroppings of rock that create huge rapids that are nearly impossible to navigate with a boat. And the first cataract sits around where the ancient border of Egypt was to the south, around what we call modern Aswan. In addition, to the east and west of the Nile Valley, we have the eastern and western deserts that were quite difficult to traverse. Thus, these natural elements made Egypt difficult to invade and helped sustain a somewhat stable political situation for Egypt for thousands of years. So while the stereotypical image of Egypt is one of undulating sand dunes, the reality is that most people did not live in the desert, and instead these deserts acted as a natural barrier for the country. For most ancient Egyptians who lived along the Nile Valley or in the Nile Delta, life was instead actually pretty damp, and even sometimes quite muddy. If you're interested in learning more about ancient Egypt, make sure to check out my other videos and take a look at the links in the description below for a list of books that I recommend about ancient Egypt. If you've enjoyed this video, do give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss future videos like this one. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.